A struggling artist drew a portrait for a stranger who turned out to be a famous art collector. That single moment would change everything. Though Marcus Elliott didn't know it yet, as he sat on the worn bench in Central Park, his fingers stained with charcoal and his stomach hollow with hunger. The late September air carried the first whisper of autumn, rustling through leaves beginning their transformation from vibrant green to burnished gold. Marcus pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders. The coat, like his hopes, had seen better days. 3 years in New York City had worn them both thin. He opened his sketchbook, the one luxury he allowed himself when rent was due and his refrigerator stood empty. The blank page stared back at him, as white and unforgiving as the gallery walls that had rejected his work last week. Too derivative, they'd said. Not commercial enough. Come back when you found your voice. His voice. Marcus almost laughed. How could he find something that felt increasingly like a phantom limb, present in memory but absent in reality? A jogger passed. A couple walked hand in hand. A man in a business suit checked his watch. Marcus began to sketch, his hand moving without intention, capturing fragments of humanity that moved around him while he remained still. This was how he survived now. Quick sketches sold to tourists for $20. Barely enough for groceries, but insufficient for his mounting debts. His phone vibrated. Another text from his landlord. Third one this week. Marcus ignored it and continued drawing, his charcoal moving faster, harder against the paper. The lines became sharp, almost angry. He'd come to New York with dreams as vast as the skyline. Now he was contemplating the bus ticket back to Ohio, back to his father's knowing stare that said, "I told you art wouldn't pay the bills." "Excuse me." The voice cut through his thoughts. Marcus looked up, blinking as though waking from a trance. A man stood before him, tall and imposing against the afternoon sun, his features momentarily lost in shadow. "Sorry to interrupt," the man said, stepping slightly to the side so his face came into view. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they landed on. His coat was camel hair, expensive but not ostentatious. "I've been watching you draw." Marcus instinctively closed his sketchbook. Years of rejection had taught him to guard his work, to protect the fragile thread of creativity that still remained. "You're very talented," the man continued, undeterred. "Would you consider drawing me?" The request was so unexpected that Marcus found himself speechless for a moment. Street portraits weren't his passion, they were his survival. "I'll pay you, of course," the man added, misinterpreting Marcus's hesitation. "No, it's not that," Marcus said quickly. "I mean, yes, I can draw you. It's $50. The lie came easily. He'd never charged more than 20, but something about the man's polished shoes and the quiet confidence in his stance suggested he could afford more. Maybe this could cover the overdue electric bill. The man didn't flinch at the price. He simply nodded and settled onto the bench beside Marcus, arranging himself with the ease of someone accustomed to being observed. "Should I smile?" he asked. "Be natural," Marcus said, opening to a fresh page. "Look toward the duck pond if you'd like. Sometimes it's easier if you're not staring at me." The man turned his gaze toward the water, and Marcus began to draw. There was something fascinating about the stranger's face, lines etched by experience rather than just age, eyes that held a quiet intensity. As Marcus's charcoal moved across the paper, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in months, losing himself in the work. He forgot about the overdue rent, the empty refrigerator, the looming deadline to either make it or go home defeated. For 20 minutes, there was only the face emerging on the paper, a life captured in carbon and shadow. When he finished, Marcus surprised himself by feeling a twinge of pride. It was good, perhaps the best work he'd done since arriving in New York. Something about the man had inspired him to push beyond the perfunctory tourist sketches he'd been churning out. "It's done," Marcus said, suddenly reluctant to show it. The drawing revealed too much, not just of his subject, but of himself, of what he could still create when the weight of failure wasn't crushing his hand. The man turned back, his eyes expectant. Marcus hesitated, then turned the sketchbook around. The stranger's reaction was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a soft intake of breath. He stared at the portrait for a long moment before reaching out, his fingers hovering just above the page as though afraid to touch it. "May I?" he asked. Marcus nodded, and the man carefully took the sketchbook, studying the portrait with the intensity of someone reading a letter containing life-altering news. "You've captured something here," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Something most people wouldn't see." Marcus shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "It's just a sketch." "No," the man shook his head firmly. "This isn't just anything. You have a remarkable gift for seeing beneath the surface." He handed the sketchbook back and reached for his wallet. Marcus braced himself for the usual haggling that followed a street portrait, the inevitable attempt to reduce the agreed price. Instead, the man pulled out several bills and handed them over without counting. "Thank you for your time." Marcus looked down at the money in his hand and froze. The man hadn't given him $50. He'd given him $300. "Sir, this is too much," Marcus stammered, trying to hand back the excess. "It's what the work is worth," the man said simply. He stood, buttoning his coat against the cooling afternoon air. "Do you have a card? Somewhere I could see more of your work?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. A card. Something so basic, so fundamental to being a professional artist, and he didn't have one. Another reminder of how far he was from his dreams. "I don't. Not with me," he lied, embarrassment heating his face. The man seemed to understand the truth behind the words. He reached into his breast pocket and produced his own card, handing it to Marcus. "My name is Edward Harrington. If you're interested, I'd like to see your portfolio. Call that number and my assistant will arrange it." Marcus stared at the card, the heavy stock and embossed lettering speaking of wealth and position. "Why?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Edward Harrington smiled, the expression transforming his austere features. "Because that sketch tells me you see the world differently, and different perspectives interest me greatly." He glanced at his watch. "I must go. I hope to hear from you, Mr. Elliot. Marcus Elliot. Mr. Elliot." Harrington nodded once, then turned and walked away, his tall figure soon lost among the other park visitors. Marcus sat motionless, the money in one hand, the card in the other. $300 would cover his rent, buy groceries, maybe even new supplies. It was a reprieve, a single deep breath when he'd been drowning. But it was the card that he couldn't stop staring at. Edward Harrington. The name meant nothing to Marcus, and yet the man had looked at his work with eyes that truly saw it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Marcus finally rose from the bench. For the first time in months, he walked with his head up, his shoulders straight. The weight of failure hadn't been lifted. It was too deeply embedded for that. But something had shifted. Some tiny spark had reignited. He wouldn't call the number. The idea of showing his meager portfolio to someone like Harrington was terrifying. But he'd keep the card, a tangible reminder that for one moment, someone had valued what he created. Marcus didn't know it yet, but that card would burn a hole in his pocket for exactly 3 days before desperation and a flicker of hope would drive him to pick up the phone. Marcus's apartment was a study in contradictions. The space itself was dismal. A 5th-floor walk-up with temperamental plumbing and windows that leaked cold air. But what he'd done with it transformed the mundane into something approaching magical. Every wall was covered with his work. Canvases, stacked 3 deep in some places. Sketches pinned haphazardly, creating a gallery of evolution. His paintings were bold, emotional landscapes that existed somewhere between reality and dream, each one a world unto itself. And every single one had been rejected by galleries across the city. Marcus stood in his kitchen, if the narrow strip of countertop and miniature stove could be called that, making instant coffee. 3 days had passed since his encounter with Edward Harrington, and the man's card had become a talisman of sorts. Marcus had taken to carrying it with him, occasionally taking it out just to run his thumb over the embossed lettering. Call, don't call, call, don't call. The internal debate had grown so loud it was practically audible in the small apartment. Pride told him not to call, pride and fear in equal measure. But need was a more persistent voice. Need for recognition, need for opportunity, need for something to change before he had to admit defeat. His phone sat on the counter, Harrington's number already entered but not yet dialed. Marcus stared at it as he sipped his coffee, the bitter taste matching his mood. A knock at the door startled him out of his contemplation. His landlord probably, coming to collect the rent Marcus had promised to have 3 days ago. The $300 from Harrington was sitting in an envelope on his dresser, ready to be handed over, but something had kept Marcus from seeking out Mr. Abernathy. Once the rent was paid, the money would be gone, and with it, the brief connection to whatever opportunity Harrington might represent. The knock came again, more insistent. Coming, Marcus called, setting down his coffee and crossing to the door. He swung it open, prepared to face his landlord's perpetual expression of disappointment. Instead, he found himself staring at a young woman with a sleek bob of dark hair and glasses that gave her a bookish intensity. She wore a tailored pantsuit that screamed professional competence. "Marcus Elliot?" she asked, consulting the tablet in her hand. "Yes, I'm Diane Lewis, Mr. Harrington's assistant. She looked up from her tablet, her expression neutral but assessing. He's been waiting for your call. Marcus blinked, momentarily speechless. I was just about to... Mr. Harrington doesn't generally wait for people. She continued, her tone making it clear this was an anomaly. He sent me to see if you were still interested in showing him your work. Marcus's hand tightened on the door. He sent you to find me? How did you know where I live? A small smile, almost imperceptible, touched her lips. Mr. Harrington has resources. The statement should have been unsettling, but Marcus found himself too stunned by the appearance of this woman, this tangible connection to the man who had paid him so generously for a simple sketch. May I come in? Diane asked when Marcus continued to stare. Oh, yes, sorry. He stepped back, suddenly acutely aware of his cramped apartment, the unmade futon in the corner, the dishes in the sink. It's not usually this. He trailed off, realizing there was no point in pretending his living situation was anything other than what it was. But Diane wasn't looking at the dishes or the futon. Her attention had been captured by the walls, by the explosion of color and form that transformed the shabby apartment into something else entirely. These are yours, she asked, moving toward a large canvas that dominated one wall. It depicted a cityscape at dawn, buildings emerging from darkness into light, but with an emotional resonance that made the scene almost breathe with life. Yes, Marcus said, watching her nervously. 3 years of rejection had taught him to expect criticism, to brace for the inevitable but that followed any initial appreciation. Diane studied the painting in silence, then moved to another, her expression giving nothing away. Marcus stood awkwardly by the door, fighting the urge to explain his work, to defend it before it was even attacked. After examining several pieces, Diane turned back to him. Mr. Harrington would like to see these. All of them, if possible. Marcus stared at her. All of them? Yes, we can arrange transportation. She glanced around the apartment again. How many pieces do you have that you consider portfolio ready? The question hit him like a physical blow. Portfolio ready, as if he were a real artist with a real future, not someone on the verge of giving up. I don't know. 20 maybe? 25? He gestured vaguely at the walls. Most of these. Diane nodded, making a note on her tablet. Excellent. Are you available tomorrow? Say 10 in the morning. A car will come for you and your work. Tomorrow. A car. This was happening too fast, spinning out of Marcus's control. But wasn't this exactly what he'd been waiting for? Someone to see his work, to really see it? Yes, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Tomorrow works. Perfect. Diane handed him a business card. Different from Harrington's, but clearly from the same company. Call this number if anything changes. Otherwise, be ready at 10. She moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Elliot? Yes, Mr. Harrington rarely takes this kind of personal interest. I wouldn't keep him waiting again. With that, she was gone, leaving Marcus standing in his apartment with the distinct feeling that he'd just experienced a tornado touching down briefly in his life. He looked at the card in his hand, then at his paintings surrounding him. For the first time in months, he felt something dangerous stirring in his chest. Hope. The car that arrived the next morning was black, sleek, and entirely out of place in Marcus's neighborhood. The driver, a taciturn man named Raymond, helped load Marcus's carefully wrapped canvases into the spacious trunk and back seat. Where exactly are we going? Marcus asked as they pulled away from the curb, his building receding in the rearview mirror. Mr. Harrington's gallery, Raymond replied, offering nothing more. Gallery. The word sent a jolt through Marcus. Edward Harrington wasn't just a collector, he owned a gallery. The realization made Marcus's palms sweat. He'd been rejected by so many galleries that the very word had become synonymous with disappointment. They drove into Manhattan, weaving through the morning traffic until they reached Chelsea, the heart of New York's art district. Raymond pulled up in front of a building with a deceptively simple facade, the only indication of what lay inside a small, elegant sign that read, Harrington Gallery. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew this place. Everyone in the art world knew Harrington Gallery. It represented some of the most innovative contemporary artists in the country. Its shows regularly featured in art publications. Its openings attended by critics and collectors whose opinions could make or break careers. And he was about to walk through its doors with his work that had been rejected by galleries not even a fraction as prestigious. Mr. Elliot. Diane appeared at the car door, opening it with a practiced gesture. Welcome. Let's get your work inside. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur as Marcus's paintings were carefully carried into the gallery by white-gloved assistants. He followed them through the main exhibition space, currently showing a minimalist sculpture installation, and into a back room designed specifically for private viewings. His canvases were unwrapped and arranged along the walls, the process executed with a level of care and professionalism that made Marcus's careful packaging seem amateur by comparison. He stood in the center of the room, watching his life's work being displayed, feeling simultaneously proud and terrified. "Water. Coffee?" Diane offered, appearing at his elbow. "Water, please," Marcus managed, his throat suddenly dry. She nodded and disappeared, returning moments later with a glass of water so perfectly clear it might have been distilled. "Mr. Harrington will be here shortly. Feel free to make any adjustments to the arrangement if you'd like." Then he was alone, surrounded by his paintings in a room designed to showcase art to people who understood its value. Marcus took a sip of water and tried to calm his racing heart. This opportunity was so far beyond anything he'd hoped for that it felt unreal, as if at any moment he might wake up in his cramped apartment to find it had all been a dream. The door opened and Edward Harrington entered. He wore a charcoal suit today, impeccably tailored, his silver hair combed back from his forehead. He nodded to Marcus before turning his attention to the paintings. "Mr. Elliot," he said by way of greeting, "thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation." Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Harrington moved slowly around the room, examining each painting in turn. His expression revealed nothing, his eyes moving methodically over every inch of canvas. The silence stretched out, becoming almost unbearable as Marcus watched the gallery owner study his work. Finally, Harrington stopped in front of a large canvas depicting a solitary figure standing at the edge of a turbulent sea, the sky above splitting between storm clouds and clear blue. It was one of Marcus's most personal works, painted during his first winter in New York, when homesickness and doubt had nearly sent him back to Ohio. "Tell me about this one," Harrington said, not looking away from the painting. Marcus moved to stand beside him. "I call it Threshold. It's about standing at the edge of a decision, wanting to move forward but being afraid of what lies ahead." Harrington nodded slowly. "And these?" He gestured to a series of smaller canvases, urban scenes painted in twilight colors, figures moving through spaces that seem both familiar and dreamlike. "Those are from my Passing Through series. They're about connection, or the lack of it, how we can be surrounded by people but still feel alone." "Yes," Harrington said softly. "That comes through clearly." He continued his circuit of the room, occasionally asking questions, his attention never wavering from the art. Marcus followed, answering as best he could, fighting the urge to apologize for his work, to explain away its flaws before they could be pointed out. Years of criticism had conditioned him to expect the worst. When Harrington had viewed every piece, he turned to Marcus with an expression that remained frustratingly neutral. "You've never had gallery representation?" he said. It wasn't a question. "No?" Marcus admitted. "I've been trying, but... Why do you think that is?" Harrington interrupted. The question hit like a punch to the stomach. Marcus struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound like either self-pity or arrogance. "I've been told my work isn't commercial enough," he said finally. "That it's too emotional, too personal to connect with a broader audience." Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. "And do you believe that?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "I just paint what I feel. What I see, I can't seem to do it any other way." A small smile touched Harrington's lips. "Good. That's precisely as it should be." He walked back to Threshold, standing before it with his hands clasped behind his back. "The art world is fickle, Mr. Elliot. What's too emotional one day becomes powerfully evocative the next, often depending on who's doing the looking and the talking." He turned to face Marcus fully. "I'd like to represent your work." The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that for a moment Marcus wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "You ... What?" "I'd like to represent your work," Harrington repeated. "Exclusively. I believe there's a market for what you're creating, and more importantly, I believe your voice is one that deserves to be heard." Marcus stared at him, waiting for the catch, for the but that would transform this moment from miracle to mirage. "Why?" he asked, the same question he'd asked in the park. Harrington considered him for a moment. "Because art should move people, Mr. Elliot. It should make them feel something. Your work does that. It's raw in places, yes, unrefined in others, but it's honest, authentic. Those qualities are far rarer than technical perfection. He moved to a small table in the corner where a folder lay waiting. I have a standard contract here. I suggest you take it home, read it carefully, perhaps have a lawyer look it over. We offer a 60-40 split in the artist's favor, which is generous in this market. Marcus felt lightheaded. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen. Not to him, not after years of rejection. I don't understand, he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. 3 days ago, I was drawing tourists in the park for $20. Now you want to represent me? Based on a sketch? Harrington's expression softened slightly. I've been collecting and selling art for over 30 years, Mr. Elliot. In that time, I've developed what some might call an instinct. That sketch you drew of me showed me something, a way of seeing that can't be taught. Coming here today, seeing the rest of your work, only confirmed what I already suspected. He picked up the folder and held it out. Take your time with this. There's no rush, but I do hope you'll say yes. Marcus took the folder with numb fingers. Thank you. He managed. I don't know what else to say. You don't need to say anything else, Harrington replied. Your work speaks for you. He checked his watch. I have another appointment now, but Diane will help you get your paintings back home. Unless, he paused, and you'd be comfortable leaving a few pieces here. I'd like to show them to a few select clients. Select clients. The words echoed in Marcus's head like a bell ringing. Yes, he said quickly. Of course. Whatever you think is best. Harrington nodded, satisfied. Excellent. Diane will handle the details. He extended his hand, which Marcus shook, still dazed. I look forward to our partnership, Mr. Elliot. With that, he was gone, leaving Marcus standing in a room full of his own paintings, holding a contract that represented everything he'd been working toward for years. Diane reappeared, tablet in hand. Congratulations, she said, her professional demeanor warming slightly. He doesn't offer representation often. I still can't believe it, Marcus admitted. Believe it, she said simply. Now, which pieces would you like to leave with us? The next 3 months transformed Marcus's life in ways he could never have imagined. Harrington's select clients had turned out to include some of the most influential collectors in New York, and within weeks, Marcus had sold 5 paintings at prices that left him dizzy. His financial situation changed overnight. He paid off his debts, moved into a better apartment with a proper studio space, and for the first time since moving to New York, didn't have to check his bank balance before buying groceries. But more significant than the money was the validation. After years of rejection, of being told his work wasn't good enough, people were not only seeing his paintings but connecting with them, wanting to live with them, willing to pay substantial sums to own them. And through it all, Edward Harrington guided him with a steady hand, offering advice without trying to change Marcus's artistic vision, introducing him to people who appreciated his work without expecting him to become someone he wasn't. Their professional relationship gradually evolved into something more personal. Harrington, who now insisted Marcus call him Edward, began inviting the younger man to dinners, to gallery openings, to his home to see his private collection. He shared stories from his decades in the art world, offered insights into the business side of art that Marcus had never considered, and, most importantly, treated Marcus as a peer rather than a discovery or a project. For Marcus, who had been so alone in New York, these interactions became almost as valuable as the professional opportunities. Edward was mentor, advocate, and increasingly friend. On a crisp December evening, 3 months to the day after their chance encounter in Central Park, Edward invited Marcus to dinner at his Upper East Side townhouse. It was not their first such dinner, but something in Edward's invitation suggested this one was different, more formal somehow. Marcus arrived promptly at 7, a bottle of good wine in hand, something he could afford now, and was shown into Edward's study by his housekeeper. The room was Marcus's favorite in the house. Walls lined with books and art, a fire crackling in the fireplace, comfortable leather chairs inviting conversation. Edward was standing by the window, looking out at the early winter darkness, a glass of scotch in his hand. He turned when Marcus entered, his face lighting with a genuine smile. Marcus, right on time. He crossed the room to accept the wine and shake Marcus's hand. Thank you for coming. Thanks for inviting me, Marcus replied, settling into one of the chairs by the fire. Their initial formality had long since given way to a comfortable familiarity, making this return to politeness slightly odd. Edward poured Marcus a scotch and took the seat opposite. I wanted to speak with you about something important, he said, getting straight to the point as was his habit. Your show. The show. Marcus's first solo exhibition, scheduled to open at Harrington Gallery in February. They had been planning it for weeks, selecting pieces, discussing themes, preparing the promotional materials. It was the culmination of everything that had happened since that day in the park. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, suddenly anxious. "No, no problem," Edward assured him. "Quite the opposite, in fact. Interest is extremely high. The guest list for the opening is already approaching capacity, and several major collectors have expressed interest in acquiring pieces sight unseen." Relief washed over Marcus. "That's wonderful news." "It is," Edward agreed. "But it's also why I wanted to talk to you tonight." He took a sip of his scotch, his expression growing more serious. "Success can be as challenging to navigate as failure, Marcus. Sometimes more so." Marcus frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Edward leaned forward, his eyes intent. "When I found you in that park, you were at a breaking point. Desperate, nearly defeated. Your work was powerful because it came from that place. From struggle, from the edge of giving up but choosing to continue anyway." He gestured around the room, at the art hanging on his walls. Pieces by some of the most celebrated artists of the past century. Many of these were created in similar circumstances. Moments of desperation, of need, of fighting against the tide. There's a raw truth in work created when the artist has nothing left to lose. Marcus set his glass down, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. "Are you saying my work isn't good anymore? Now that I'm not starving?" "No," Edward said firmly. "Not at all. Your talent didn't come from your circumstances. It was always there. But your perspective, your way of seeing the world was shaped by those experiences." He sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I've seen it happen too many times. An artist struggles, creates work of incredible emotional honesty, finds success, and then loses the very thing that made their work special. They become comfortable, safe. They stop taking risks." The cold feeling in Marcus's chest intensified. "You think that's happening to me?" Edward shook his head. "No, not yet, but I've been watching your newest works, the ones you've created since we met. They're still excellent, still distinctly yours, but there's a subtle shift beginning, a softening of edges. A move toward what you know will be well received rather than what challenges you and your audience." Marcus wanted to protest, to defend his recent work, but something stopped him. A recognition, perhaps, of the truth in Edward's words. His newest paintings were good, yes, but they lacked something of the desperate energy that had fueled his earlier pieces. "I'm not saying this to criticize," Edward continued, his voice gentler. "But as someone who cares about your work and about you, I want you to be aware of the pattern before it becomes entrenched." He reached for a folder on the side table, so similar to the contract he'd offered 3 months ago, and handed it to Marcus. "This is why I asked you here tonight." Marcus opened the folder to find information about an artist's retreat in the mountains upstate. A rustic but beautiful facility where artists could work in isolation, surrounded by nature, with all basic needs provided but few luxuries. "I'd like you to consider spending some time there before your show," Edward said. 6 weeks perhaps, to reconnect with yourself, with what drives your work at its deepest level." Marcus looked up from the brochure, confused. "You want me to leave New York? Now? When everything is finally going well?" "Precisely because everything is going well," Edward said. "This is the dangerous time, Marcus. The time when you could begin to create work that pleases others rather than work that matters." The suggestion stung, touching on Marcus's deepest fear, that his success was somehow undeserved, that it might disappear as quickly as it had come. "I thought you believed in my work." "I do," Edward said emphatically. "More than you know. That's why I'm suggesting this. Not because I doubt you, but because I want to protect what makes your work special." He leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "I'm not ordering you to go, Marcus. It's merely a suggestion. The retreat is paid for, should you choose to accept. Think of it as an investment in your future, in our future together." Marcus closed the folder, his mind racing. Part of him was offended by the suggestion that success might compromise his artistic integrity. But another part, the part that had always pushed him to be honest in his work, recognized the wisdom in Edward's words. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Edward nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "That's all I ask." He raised his glass in a small toast. "To your show. It's going to be remarkable, wherever you choose to prepare for it." The conversation moved on to other topics as they went into dinner, but the folder sat like a weight in Marcus's mind. That night, as he returned to his new apartment, comfortable now, but lacking the desperate energy of his old place, he found himself standing before his latest canvas. It was good work, technically perhaps his best. But looking at it with fresh eyes, he could see what Edward had observed. A subtle shift towards safety, toward pleasing the market he now knew existed for his art. Marcus ran his fingers over the dried paint, feeling the texture beneath his fingertips. Everything he'd ever wanted was finally within his grasp. Recognition, financial security, a future doing what he loved. But at what cost? The question followed him to bed, where he lay awake long into the night, thinking about parks and portraits and the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this crossroads. The artist's retreat was called Ravenswood, an old estate converted into studios and simple living quarters nestled in the Catskill Mountains. Marcus arrived on a snowy January afternoon, his car winding up the long driveway through pine trees heavy with white. He had deliberated for days after Edward's dinner invitation, torn between staying in the city to prepare for his show and taking the older man's advice. In the end, what decided him was not Edward's warning about success, but his own growing sense that something was indeed changing in his work, a subtle but persistent shift away from the raw honesty that had defined his earlier paintings. The main building of Ravenswood was a stone mansion from another era, its grandeur softened by time and repurposing. Inside, Marcus found a warm welcome from the director, a former sculptor named Helen who showed him to his quarters with minimal fuss. "We keep things simple here," she explained as they walked through hushed hallways. "Breakfast and dinner are communal in the main dining room. Lunch is left outside your studio door. There's no Wi-Fi except in the library, and we encourage residents to use it sparingly." Marcus's room was Spartan but comfortable. A single bed, a desk, a chair, and a window that looked out onto the snowy grounds. His studio, a short walk across a courtyard, was a converted carriage house, spacious and north-facing, with the perfect light for painting. "There are 12 other artists in residence currently," Helen told him. "You'll meet them at dinner. Some talk, some don't. We respect both approaches." She handed him a key and a small map of the grounds. "The only rule is that you work. How you work, when you work, what you create, that's entirely up to you." With that, she left him to settle in, returning to the main house through the gently falling snow. Marcus stood in the center of his empty studio, listening to the profound silence of the place. No car horns, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no constant hum of the city. Just quiet, broken only by the occasional soft thump of snow falling from tree branches. For the first time since Edward had made his suggestion, Marcus felt certain he had made the right decision. There was something about this place, a stillness, a removal from the world, that seemed to create space in his mind. Space he hadn't realized had become cluttered with expectations, with awareness of the market, with the subtle pressure of success. He unpacked his supplies methodically, arranging brushes, setting up his easel, preparing canvases. The familiar rituals grounded him, connecting him to every studio he'd ever worked in, every painting he'd ever created. By the time the dinner bell rang, Marcus had set up his studio exactly as he wanted it. Everything was ready. Everything except the most important element, what he would paint. The communal dinner was a quiet affair. As Helen had suggested, some of the residents were talkative, introducing themselves and asking questions about Marcus's work. Others merely nodded in greeting before focusing on their meals. No one seemed offended by either approach, creating an atmosphere of acceptance that Marcus found immediately comforting. He met a poet from Vermont, a ceramicist from Tokyo, a composer from Berlin. Each had come to Ravenswood for their own reasons, seeking the same essential thing: space to create without distraction or expectation. After dinner, Marcus returned to his studio. The snow had stopped, and moonlight reflected off the white ground, filling the space with a silvery glow. He stood before an empty canvas, brush in hand, and waited for inspiration. Nothing came. The next day was the same, and the next. Marcus would spend hours in his studio, attempting to begin, but every idea felt forced, calculated, a performance of what he thought he should create rather than an authentic expression. By the end of his first week at Ravenswood, panic had begun to set in. His show was less than 2 months away. Edward expected new work, powerful work, and Marcus was producing nothing but frustrated sketches and abandoned starts. On the 8th day, in desperation, he bundled up and went for a walk in the woods surrounding the estate. The cold air bit at his cheeks as he trudged through snow-covered paths, his mind churning with self-doubt. What if Edward had been wrong? What if removing himself from the energy of the city, from the connections and opportunities he'd finally found, had cut him off from his creative source rather than reconnecting him to it. Deep in the woods, Marcus found a small clearing where a fallen tree provided a place to sit. The snow had been partially melted by a patch of sunlight breaking through the evergreen canopy, creating a small oasis in the winter landscape. Marcus brushed the remaining snow from the log and sat, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Around him, the forest was alive with subtle sounds. The creak of branches, the soft fall of snow, the distant call of a bird. He closed his eyes, focusing on these sounds, letting them wash over him. Gradually, a stillness settled over him. Not the forced stillness of trying to create, but the natural stillness of simply being present. His breathing slowed, his mind quieted, and for the first time since arriving at Ravenswood, Marcus felt the knot of anxiety in his chest begin to loosen. He opened his eyes to find a fox standing at the edge of the clearing, its red coat vivid against the snow, its eyes fixed on him with wild intelligence. Neither moved, observer and observed locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the fox turned and vanished into the underbrush, leaving only a set of delicate tracks in the snow. Marcus sat for a long time after the fox had gone, something shifting inside him. He had come to Ravenswood seeking his artistic voice, thinking of it as something he might have lost. But sitting in that clearing, he realized that his voice had never been lost. It had simply been drowned out by the noise of success, by the subtle but persistent pressure to continue producing work that would sell. When he finally returned to his studio, night had fallen. Without turning on the lights, Marcus stood before a fresh canvas in the darkness. The moonlight through the windows cast everything in shades of silver and shadow, reducing the world to its simplest elements. He began to paint. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of creative energy, unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. He worked from dawn until well past midnight, stopping only when his body demanded rest or food. The paintings that emerged were different from his earlier work, deeper somehow, more essential, as if he had stripped away layers to reach something fundamental beneath. He painted the fox in the clearing, not as a realistic depiction, but as a spirit of wildness, of untamed possibility. He painted the woods in winter, the silence of snow, the hidden life beneath the frozen surface. He painted from memory, from imagination, from that quiet place he had rediscovered in the forest. And he painted himself, not in self-portraits, but in canvases that captured his journey from desperate street artist to the threshold of success, each work a visual memoir of transformation. When Edward arrived at Ravenswood in the final week of Marcus's retreat, he found a transformed artist. Marcus, who had been warned of his mentor's visit, met him at the main house with a quiet confidence that had been absent before. "You look well," Edward observed as they walked toward the studio. "The mountain air agrees with you." "It's not the air," Marcus replied. "It's the silence, the space to hear myself again." Edward nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then my suggestion was not entirely misguided?" Marcus smiled. "Not entirely, no." They reached the studio door, and Marcus paused, suddenly nervous. These new works were different, rawer, more essential, less obviously commercial than what he had been creating in the city. Would Edward see their value, or would he see a step backward? "Before we go in," Marcus said, "I should warn you, these aren't what you might be expecting." Edward raised an eyebrow. "I never expect, Marcus. I only hope to be moved." Taking a deep breath, Marcus opened the door. The afternoon light streamed through the north-facing windows, illuminating canvases arranged around the studio. 15 new works created during his time at Ravenswood. Edward entered slowly, moving from painting to painting with the careful attention he always gave to art. His expression revealed nothing as he studied each canvas, occasionally leaning closer to examine a detail, sometimes stepping back to take in the whole. Marcus waited by the door, his heart pounding. These paintings represented something more personal than anything he had created before, not because their subjects were intimate, but because they came from a place of complete artistic honesty, unconcerned with market or audience. When Edward had viewed every piece, he turned to Marcus. For a long moment, he said nothing, his face still unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his features. Not his usual reserved expression, but something warmer, more genuine. "Ces," he said simply, "is why I found you in that park." Relief washed through Marcus like a physical sensation. "You like them?" "Like them?" Edward shook his head. "Marcus, these are extraordinary. They're truthful in a way that's rare. You found something here that most artists spend their entire lives seeking." He moved to stand before a large canvas depicting the clearing where Marcus had seen the fox. In the painting, the boundaries between animal, forest, and light had been dissolved, creating an image that was more emotion than representation. "This is what I hoped might happen," Edward continued, his voice soft with something like wonder. "Not just good work, but a breakthrough. A new level entirely." Marcus joined him, looking at the painting with fresh eyes. "It was hard at first. Nothing would come. I thought you'd been wrong to send me here. And then I stopped trying so hard," Marcus said. "I went walking in the woods. I saw a fox, and something shifted." Edward nodded. "The hardest lesson for any artist: you can't force the work. You can only prepare yourself, create the conditions, and then wait for grace." He turned to face Marcus fully. "These will be the centerpiece of your show, not instead of your earlier work, but alongside it, showing the evolution, the journey." "Are you sure?" Marcus asked. "They're different. Less accessible, maybe." Edward laughed softly. "Accessible is not what makes art endure, Marcus. Truth is, and these," he gestured around the studio, "these are true." As they left the studio, the late afternoon sun was turning the snowy landscape golden. Edward paused on the path, looking out over the grounds of Ravenswood. "You know," he said conversationally, "I never told you why I was in the park that day." Marcus realized with a start that this was true. In all their conversations over the past months, the coincidence that had brought them together had never been fully explained. "I'd had a doctor's appointment," Edward continued. "Not a pleasant one. Some test results that were concerning." He shrugged slightly. "I didn't want to go straight back to the gallery, to all those people with their expectations and demands. So I walked in the park, thinking about mortality, about legacy." He turned to Marcus, his expression reflective. "I've spent my life surrounding myself with art, with beauty created by others. I've supported artists, promoted their work, built collections and careers, but I've never created anything myself." The confession surprised Marcus. Edward had always seemed so complete, so confident in his role in the art world. "When I saw you drawing," Edward went on, "there was something in your focus, in your complete absorption in the act of creation that struck me. Here was a young man with nothing, no gallery, no patrons, no security, making art anyway, because he had to, because it was who he was." He smiled, a touch of sadness in his eyes. "I envied you in that moment, and I wanted to be part of whatever you might become." Marcus was silent, moved by this unexpected glimpse into Edward's inner life. "The test turned out to be a false alarm, by the way," Edward added, his tone lightening. "But the perspective remains. Life is brief, Marcus. The only things that matter are what we create and who we connect with along the way." As they walked back toward the main house, snow beginning to fall again in gentle flakes, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity Edward had given him, but for the wisdom he continued to share, the mentorship that had become friendship. "Thank you," he said simply, "for finding me in that park, for seeing something in that sketch." Edward nodded, acknowledgement rather than acceptance of gratitude. "Art is a conversation across time, Marcus. Between artist and viewer, between generations, between souls who may never meet except through the work. I'm grateful to be part of your conversation." They continued in companionable silence, their footprints marking a shared path through the untouched snow. The night of Marcus Elliott's debut solo exhibition at Harrington Gallery was unseasonably warm for February, bringing out a larger crowd than even Edward's optimistic projections. By 7 o'clock, the gallery was filled with collectors, critics, fellow artists, and the culturally curious who had heard through New York's efficient art world grapevine that this was a show not to be missed. Marcus stood in a quiet corner, watching the crowd move through the space, observing their reactions to his work. He wore a new suit, nothing flashy, but well-fitted and appropriate for the occasion, and held a barely touched glass of champagne. Despite Edward's careful preparation, nothing had quite readied him for the surreal experience of seeing strangers engage with his most personal creations. The exhibition had been meticulously arranged to tell the story of his artistic journey. The first room featured his earlier works, the ones created in his tiny apartment when rent was always overdue and meals were often skipped. Raw, emotional paintings born of struggle and longing. The middle room showcased the transitional pieces, created during his first months of success, technically accomplished but showing the subtle shift toward pleasing the market that Edward had identified. And then the final room, the heart of the exhibition, the 15 canvases created at Ravenswood. These had been hung with particular care, the lighting adjusted to enhance their depth and emotional resonance, the spacing allowing each piece room to breathe. It was in this room that Marcus now stood, watching as viewers moved from painting to painting, their expressions shifting from interest to something deeper: surprise, recognition, emotional connection. "They get it," said a voice beside him. Edward had appeared silently, his own champagne glass empty. "Look at their faces. They're not just seeing, they're feeling." Marcus nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the scene before him. "It's strange. All those years of painting alone, imagining someone might connect with the work someday. And now it's happening." Edward finished for him. "This is just the beginning, Marcus. These people will talk. Word will spread. Your voice will reach further than you can imagine." A critic approached, wanting to introduce herself to Marcus, and Edward stepped away, allowing his protege the spotlight. For the next 2 hours, Marcus found himself in constant conversation, explaining his process, discussing influences, accepting congratulations from collectors who had already purchased pieces. By the time the crowd began to thin, Marcus was exhausted but exhilarated. The exhibition was unquestionably a success. Several pieces had sold for prices that would have seemed impossible to him a year ago, and the critical response, at least informally, had been overwhelmingly positive. As the last guest departed, Edward locked the gallery doors and turned to Marcus with a smile of genuine pride. "Congratulations, you've arrived." Marcus looked around at his work, at the empty champagne glasses and discarded programs. Evidence of the night's success. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Edward shook his head. "No, I provided opportunity, that's all. The talent, the vision, the dedication, those were always yours." He gestured toward the room of Ravenswood paintings. "Those would have existed whether I found you in the park or not. Perhaps not on these walls, not yet. But they were in you, waiting." They walked together through the gallery, turning off lights, preparing to leave. When they reached the small office at the back, Edward stopped. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a flat package wrapped in simple brown paper. "A celebration gift." Marcus unwrapped it carefully to find a framed drawing. His drawing, the charcoal portrait he had created of Edward in the park 6 months ago. "You kept it," he said, surprised and touched. "Of course I kept it," Edward replied. "It's where our story begins." Marcus studied the portrait with new eyes. It was good work. He could see that now with more objective distance. But more importantly, it was honest work. Despite being created for money for survival, it had captured something essential about Edward. Something beneath the surface that Marcus had instinctively seen and recorded. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing Edward would understand that the gratitude extended far beyond the gift itself. Edward nodded, then glanced at his watch. "It's late. You should get some rest. Tomorrow the real work begins. Interviews, follow-ups with collectors, planning what comes next." "What does come next?" Marcus asked, suddenly aware that he had been so focused on this show, this moment, that he had given little thought to what would follow. Edward smiled. "That's entirely up to you. But whatever it is, I'll be here to help you navigate it." He put a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of both affection and reassurance. "This is not an ending, Marcus. It's a beginning." As they left the gallery, stepping out into the New York night, Marcus felt a profound sense of coming full circle. 6 months ago, he had sat on a park bench, hungry and desperate, drawing strangers for survival. Tonight, he walked beside his mentor, his friend, with his first solo exhibition behind him and a future full of possibility ahead. The city stretched around them, a landscape of light and shadow, not unlike one of Marcus's paintings. Somewhere in that urban expanse was the park bench where chance, or perhaps something more meaningful, had brought artist and collector together. Marcus paused, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. "I never asked, why did you want me to draw your portrait that day? You must have sat for professional portraits before." Edward considered the question, his breath forming clouds in the night air. "I saw something in the way you were drawing, a total absorption, as if nothing existed but you and your subject. I wanted to experience that focus, to be seen that way." He smiled slightly. "And perhaps I wanted to test my instinct about your talent." "And if the portrait had been terrible?" Marcus asked, half joking. Edward laughed, the sound warm in the cool night. "Then we would not be standing here now. But I would have still overpaid you because you looked like you needed a meal." They continued walking, comfortable in the silence that followed. Two artists, one who created with his hands, one who created by recognizing and nurturing talent in others, connected by a chance encounter that had grown into something neither could have predicted. Above them, the stars continued their ancient patterns, witnessing another story of human connection, of transformation through unexpected kindness, of art's power to bridge worlds and change lives. And somewhere in the city, perhaps another struggling artist sat alone, waiting for their moment, their connection, their chance to be truly seen. A struggling artist had drawn a portrait for a stranger who turned out to be a famous art collector. And in that simple act, two lives had been forever changed.